supply of electricity too cheap to meter. In 1957, the first nuclear power plant went online, followed by a surge of plant orders. As more plants went into operation, however, it became clear that this new source of energy was far from perfect. Even by the mid-60s, nuclear power plants were costing over twice as much as predicted. Today, with over 100 plants in operation, there have been 2 major nuclear accidents and several near accidents. New plants commonly take twice as much time and 10 times as much money to build as projected, making consumers face rate hikes and utilities face bankruptcy. It still has not been determined what should be done with all the nuclear waste that is mounting by the minute, and the possibility of a serious accident still looms within the core of each reactor. For these reasons, we, the Affirmative, believe that the construction of new nuclear power plants should be terminated as soon as possible. Our case rests on 2 main points. First, nuclear power is not safe, and second, nuclear power is not economical. I will first demonstrate that nuclear power is not safe for 5 reasons. First, a nuclear accident could do colossal amounts of damage to the public and the environment. Second, the presence of human error makes any nuclear plant unsafe. Third, nuclear power plants have had a dangerous operating. Fourth, normally operating plants release dangerous amounts of radiation into the environment. And fifth, nuclear waste is unsafe. My first argument is that a serious accident at a nuclear power plant could do colossal damage to the public and the environment. This is supported by the Chernobyl accident of 2 years ago. 32 people were killed directly by the Chernobyl accident, but it is more startling to note that it is estimated that between 5,000 and 75,000 people in the Soviet Union and Western Europe will die of cancer because of Chernobyl-caused radiation. Mike Edwards, National Geographic, May 1987. My second support is a projection done by John Berger in his book, Nuclear Power, the Unviable Option. If a 1,000 megawatt reactor 30 miles from a city of 1 million experienced a meltdown but released only 10% of its radioactivity, quote, agriculture and water supplies would be ruined in an area larger than California, over 3,000 people would die from acute radiation exposure, and 50,000 people would die of cancer years later. Thus, I have shown that a nuclear accident would have terrible consequences. My second argument against nuclear power is that the constant factor of human error makes it impossible for any plant to be entirely safe. First, quote, ultimately, every nuclear plant is in the hands of the people who operate and maintain it. But people, like parts, are fallible. The 3 Mile Island accident, as well as other accidents, demonstrates that operator errors can turn otherwise routine malfunctions into serious accidents. Union of Concerned Scientists, Safety of Nuclear Power Reactors, October 1985. My second support is that operators in charge of watching monitors and readout in plant control rooms have very tedious jobs and are prone to not minding their work. Quote, NRC files document at least 5 incidents of snoozing and over 100 instances of drug use since 1981. Ronald Taylor, U.S. News and World Report, 13th April 1987. Thus, I have shown that human error at a nuclear plant is certainly possible. My third argument that nuclear power is unsafe is that mechanical problems plague nuclear power plants and make them unsafe. I have 3 supports. First, quote, in October 1982, the NRC reported that only 6.6% of the safety equipment in nuclear power reactors was shown to be fully qualified. Union of Concerned Scientists, Safety of Nuclear Power Reactors, 1985. Secondly, there have been over 50, quote, unscheduled incidents or events which the NRC determines as significant from the standpoint of public safety on the record since 1980. Donna Casada, News Gazette, 26 April 1987. And lastly, the NRC estimates that there is a 45% chance of another core meltdown as bad or worse than TMI in the next 20 years. Larry Marks, Newsweek, 12 May 1986. Hence, it is obvious that mechanical error could cause a serious accident at a nuclear plant. My fourth argument that nuclear power is unsafe is that the radiation released by all operating plants is dangerous to the public. Jay Gould, a statistician who conducted an extensive survey of counties downwind from nuclear power plants, such as Champaign County, for the Council on Economic Priorities in December 1986, concluded that some 9,000 Americans are killed yearly by commercial reactor emissions. Harvey Wasserman, The Nation, 12 September 1987. My fifth and final argument that nuclear power is unsafe is that nuclear waste storage and transportation present serious public health hazards. The first support is that all it could take is a slight temperature rise at a nuclear waste dump for the radioactive materials to enter the environment. Quote, probably the worst of all accidents, only the Soviets know for sure, was the explosion of a nuclear waste dump that went critical at Chisholm in the Ural Mountains in 1957. An area of over 400 square miles was contaminated. A river had to be diverted around it. The ultimate human toll can't even be guessed. Larry Martz, Newsweek, 12 May 1986. My second support is that nuclear waste transportation is also very dangerous. Clyde Sweet, who used to manage a plutonium reprocessing plant, says that, quote, probably one of the biggest potentials for disaster is moving the stuff around. And whether it's by train or truck or however else, they have to move it around. Clyde Sweet, personal interview, 22 March 1988. This is especially disconcerting since the nuclear power plants in existence today will produce over 3 cubic kilometers of nuclear waste in their entire lifetime, plus decommissioning, which could cover the entire state of Illinois at a depth of nearly 1 inch. Nuclear Energy Agency Decommissioning of Nuclear Facilities, 1986. Thus, it is clear that nuclear waste is a serious safety problem of nuclear power. I've now shown that nuclear power plants are not safe. I will now show that they are also grossly uneconomical, for 5 reasons. $4.3 billion and is years behind schedule. Don Dodson, News Gazette, 4 October 1987. Thus, it is clear that the cost of constructing nuclear power plants has gone far out of control. My second argument that nuclear power is uneconomical is that the costs from decommissioning are also astronomical. Economist Duane Chapman, an independent analyst at Cornell University, estimates that decommissioning a plant will cost as much as the original construction. In the U.S., this means approximately $3 billion for a new 1,000 megawatt unit. Cynthia Pollack, Environment, March 1986. My third argument that nuclear power is uneconomical is that nuclear plants are generally rather unreliable at producing electricity. Quote, large nuclear reactors, which have an average reliability factor of only 58% compared to 81% for your typical baseload coal plant, have accelerated utility reliability problems, and they have increased the need for larger reserve margins to supplement plants that are out of service. Richard Munson, The Energy Switch, 1987. My fourth argument that nuclear power is uneconomical is that it has been increasing consumer electric rates for businesses and the American public. For example, Illinois power customers are being directly charged $3.3 billion to help IP pay for the Clinton nuclear power plant. This works out to over $1,500 per household. Don Dodson, News Gazette, 4 October 1987. The same situation can be seen across the country. New Hampshire residents face rate hikes of 60% because of the Seabrook albatross, and the canceled Marble Hill plant in Indiana is shooting rates up by almost a factor of 3. John DeMott, Time, 23 July 1984. My fifth and final argument that nuclear power is uneconomical is that utilities are financially suffering because of their investments in nuclear power. First, quote, late last year, shares in 41 investor-owned utilities were selling at prices at least equal to their book value, and only 3 of those were investing in nuclear power plants. 6 were selling for less than 45% of their book value, and all 6 were building nuclear power plants. Lynn Weaver, Vital Speeches, 1 March 1985. Second, quote, because of nuclear power, about half a dozen of America's 100 largest utilities are near bankruptcy. The companies themselves are teetering. This is the closest utilities have come to bankruptcy at any time in our history. Thus, it is clear that nuclear power financially hurts utilities. In summary, I have shown that nuclear power is neither a safe nor economical form of energy. It is not safe because of the magnitude of what could result in the event of an accident and the high probability thereof due to faulty equipment and human error. The problems of radiation emissions and nuclear waste also make nuclear plants unsafe. Furthermore, I have shown conclusively that nuclear power is not economical because of high construction costs, high decommissioning costs, and its unreliability at producing electricity. This poor economy is evidenced through rising electric rates and the fact that many utilities are being dragged towards bankruptcy because of their nuclear investments. In a few minutes, my colleagues will present our plan to solve the problems with nuclear power and prove that our plan is feasible. But first, to make sure that you hear both sides of the issue, we'll hear from Dan Jacobson from representing the negative.
The affirmative states that we should discontinue the development of nuclear power in the United States. This plan of action must not be taken. Nuclear power is safe, economically feasible, and a practical way to meet this country's growing needs for energy. Nuclear power has not been given proper recognition, and the public, which is now mostly against nuclear power, has not been given the right information to judge it fairly. There is a strong need to develop the industry, not to abandon it. Furthermore, without nuclear power, this country will be much worse off than it is now. We will have to depend on rapidly depleting energy sources that are not as safe, as cheap, or as reliable as nuclear power. Nuclear power is essential to this country's energy mix. At this point, we, the negative, would like to accept the definition of terms printed on the handout. I have 4 arguments showing that there is no need to stop the licensing of nuclear power plants in the United States. First, nuclear power is a safe method of generating electricity. Second, nuclear waste is not a problem and is safely taken care of by the nuclear industry. Third, nuclear power is economically feasible. And fourth, nuclear energy has been a successful, practical, and reliable way of producing electricity in the United States. My first argument is that nuclear power is a safe way of generating electricity in the United States. There are 4 reasons for this. First, the risk from nuclear power plants is very small. Second, U.S. nuclear plants are safely designed. Third, strict NRC regulations make a serious nuclear accident in the United States nearly impossible. Fourth, due to secure containment, in the unlikely event of an accident, damage to humans and the environment would be minimal. The first reason that nuclear power is safe in the United States is that the risk from nuclear power plants and their waste facilities to the environment, the public, and the plant workers is very small, and in some cases is much less than the risk involved in running other types of power plants. I have 2 supports. First, quote, even if the average risk from nuclear power plants were as much as 10 deaths per year, similar to the liability from an ordinary coal-fired plant, this would still contribute very little risk to the public. Michio Kaku and Jennifer Traynor, Nuclear Power Both Sides, 1982. Second, quote, people who live near the 4 nuclear power plants in the state have no greater risk of cancer than other Connecticut residents, the State Department of Health Services said in a draft report. Deborah Duffy, Hartford Courant, 18 November 1987. The second reason that nuclear power is safe is that the U.S. nuclear power plants are much more safely designed than the Chernobyl reactor, and thus accidents in this country are highly unlikely. I have 2 supports. First, quote, the Chernobyl reactor, being graphite moderated and with pressure tubes, rather than water moderated and with a single pressure vessel, is not really comparable to the reactors that account for most of the world's nuclear power. Alvin Weinberg, Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, September 1986. Second, quote, at a Vienna meeting, the head of the Soviet nuclear power program acknowledged that a similar accident could not occur in any American plant. Charles Ebinger, New York Times, 1987. The third reason that nuclear power is safe is that NRC regulations make dangerous accidents nearly impossible in the United States. Once again, I have 2 supports. First, quote, it is important to bear in mind that not all reactors are equally safe. American standards are stricter, and American commitment to safety and environmental protection is more pronounced. W.K. Davis, Nuclear Power Experience, 1982. Second, quote, since a TMI accident, every U.S. reactor must have at least 1 fully trained nuclear engineer available at all times. Hans Beth, Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, December 1986. The fourth reason that nuclear power is safe is that in the event of an accident in the U.S., damage to humans and the environment would be minimal. I have 2 supports. First, quote, there is clearly an additional very large factor of safety for the public for light water reactor containment, even given that a core damaging accident might again happen. In contrast to the essentially uncontained top of the Chernobyl reactor, which virtually ensured that in the event of a core damaging accident, which virtually ensured that major environmental damage would occur if there were a core damaging accident. The U.S. type containment provides a large and important margin of safety for the public. Hans Beth, Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, December 1986. Second, quote, industry spokesmen say that American reactors are intrinsically more stable and have faster-acting emergency shutdown systems than Soviet ones. Moreover, American reactors have control and safety systems that are strictly separated, and reactors are safeguarded against the releases of radioactive material by containment domes. New York Times, April 1987. I have thus shown that nuclear power is safe, so there is no need to stop the development of nuclear power in the United States. My second argument showing that there is no need to stop licensing nuclear power plants is that nuclear waste is not a problem. I have 2 supports. First, quote, during the last 30 years, the transport of such material has become more and more common, has grown to over 8 million shipments per year, yet no accidents with serious consequence to the public have occurred. Safe transport of radioactive material, 1983. Second, quote, less than 1% of nuclear material shipments that take place today are to or from nuclear plants or elsewhere in the commercial and nuclear fuel cycle. Safe transportation of radioactive material, 1983. I have thus proven my second argument, that nuclear waste is not a danger and therefore there is no need to stop the licensing of nuclear power plants in the United States. My third argument, proving that there is no need to stop licensing of nuclear power plants in the U.S., is that nuclear power is economically feasible. There are three reasons for this. First, nuclear energy has been proven cost-effective worldwide. Second, nuclear fuel, uranium, is efficient and abundant. Third, decommissioning will be economically feasible. The first reason showing economic feasibility is that nuclear power has been proven cost-effective around the world. I have two supports. First, quote, France not only boasts the lowest electricity prices in Europe, with electricity generated from nuclear power plants costing two-thirds that from coal-fired plants, but it is currently exporting more than 23 billion kilowatts of kilowatt hours per year to its European neighbors. David Dixon, Science, August 1987. Second, quote, the Japanese Ministry of International Trade has issued its annual estimates of electricity generation costs from different fuels for fiscal 1986. It found that nuclear was cheapest over the lifetime of a plant. Nuclear Engineering International, April 1987. The second reason that nuclear power is economically feasible is that nuclear plant fuel, uranium, is efficient and abundant. I have two supports. First, quote, it is then shaped into small cylinders known as fuel pellets. The pellets are less than 1/2 inch thick in diameter, but each one can produce as much energy as 120 gallons of oil. Nuclear power from fission reactors, an introduction, 1982. Second, quote, if it is shipped to a reprocessing plant, valuable fuel would be separated from radioactive waste. The waste material would then be stored safely, and the fuel would be available to be used again. Nuclear power from fission reactors, an introduction, 1982. My third reason that nuclear power is economically feasible is that decommissioning can be made economically feasible. I have one support. Quote, various studies have estimated the cost of decommissioning a commercial nuclear reactor at $100 to $150 million. These funds are collected over the life of a typical commercial nuclear plant as an insignificant portion of everyone's bill. Electric Energy Sources, 1987. I have now shown my third argument, that nuclear power is economically feasible, and therefore there is no reason to stop the licensing of nuclear power plants in the United States. My fourth and final argument, showing that there is no need to stop licensing nuclear power plants, is that nuclear energy has been a successful, practical, and reliable way to produce electricity in the U.S. I have two supports. First, quote, today nuclear energy has become our second largest source of electric power, overtaking oil, natural gas, and hydropower. Harold Finger, Omni, December 1986. Second, quote, contrary to charges of critics, nuclear power has lived up to its early promise. Harold Finger, Omni, December 1986. Thus, I have shown my final argument, that nuclear power has been a successful, practical, and reliable way to produce electricity in the United States, and thus there is no need to stop licensing of nuclear power plants in the United States. In conclusion, I have thoroughly demonstrated that there is no need to stop licensing nuclear power plants through these four arguments. 1. Nuclear power is a safe way of producing electricity in the United States. 2. Nuclear waste is safely disposed of. 3. Nuclear power is economically feasible. 4. Nuclear energy has been and will continue to be a successful, reliable, and practical way to produce electricity in the United States. My colleague will continue our argument, showing that our opponent's plan to stop licensing U.S. nuclear plants is not feasible.
My name is Heumann. My colleague has already proven there's a definite need for the phasing out of nuclear power plants in the United States. To remedy these problems, our plan proposes that nuclear power be phased out in the U.S. and gradually replaced by renewable energy sources, which will eventually take over all energy production in the United States. The basis of our plan is that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission will cease to issue construction licenses to fission-based nuclear power plants as of January 1st, 1989. If a plant has already obtained a construction license by this date, this plant will be allowed to complete its construction and to apply for an operating license. Furthermore, nuclear power plants which have received operating licenses by 1989 will not be affected. In the interest of developing alternate sources of energy, the Department of Energy and independent institutions will continue experiments funded by larger grants from the government. Our main prospect for alternate energy is in the development, promotion, and implementation of renewable energy sources. The renewable energies which prove most promising include 1. Photovoltaic energy, where sunlight is converted directly to electricity, and 2. Hydroelectric power, which uses specially designed hydroelectric dams, but conventional dams can be converted to produce electricity. Energy conservation, often called a passive solar energy source, which consists of better insulation for homes and more efficient appliances in order to decrease energy demand growth, will also be promoted. While the renewable energies are developing, coal power plants will remain in operation. However, all existing coal plants will be required to install the latest available anti-pollution equipment. Furthermore, research on how nuclear waste can be safely stored will be continued. Our plan is for renewable energy to replace nuclear power before the time the last plant is scheduled to be decommissioned in 2025, and then have renewable energy gradually take over the entire production in the U.S. I would now like to demonstrate the feasibility of our plan. I will show 1, nuclear power does not produce a very large percentage of the energy in the United States. 2, renewable energy sources show every indication of becoming technically, financially, and commercially viable. And 3, conservation is capable of decreasing the demand for electricity. Then my colleague will conclude by showing 4, clean coal technology is cheap, long-lasting, and safer than the nuclear alternative. 5, the transition from nuclear power will present no problems. And 6, nuclear power is losing its popularity universally. My first argument for replacing nuclear power with renewable energy is that the nuclear power does not produce a very large percentage of the energy in the U.S. In 1985, nuclear power plants produced only 16% of the U.S.'s electricity. International Atomic Energy Agency Nuclear Power Stats and Trends, 1986. My second argument for replacing nuclear power is that renewable energy sources show every indication of becoming technically, commercially, and financially viable. Quote, if small-scale power projects and renewable resources continue to be launched at the current pace, the U.S. alone would obtain 60,000 megawatts from them by the end of the century, or about as much as nuclear power now provides. Christopher Flavin, The Futurist, April 85. Today I only have time to discuss photovoltaic and hydroelectric energy. Photovoltaic energy is a renewable source that is both capable of replacing nuclear power and is cost-effective. I have 2 supports showing that photovoltaic energy is feasible. First, in 1988 alone, solar energy will add as much power to the electric grid as 4 large nuclear plants, Larry and Stoican, Alternate Sources of Energy, January 88. Second, John Berger, Nuclear Power, the Inviable Option, 86, says, quote, the surface area of the U.S. alone receives about 9,000 trillion kilowatt hours per year in solar energy, an amount roughly 600 times our current energy use. Even in the rainy northwest U.S., the equivalent of 3 times the average household electricity use can be collected from the rooftops of these same residences. Photovoltaic energy is also economically feasible. I have 2 supports. First, quote, the cost of photovoltaic modules has declined considerably from $300 per watt several years ago to an average of $6 per watt in 1987. No author, Alternate Sources of Energy, December 87. In fact, Solar Plant 1 went online for $2.80 per installed watt. Clinton cost 52% more per watt, while Seabrook cost 96% more. Jim Schefter, Popular Science, February 85. Hydropower is another renewable energy alternative which can provide the U.S. with a more than sufficient amount of energy. I have 2 supports. First, according to Barry Commodore, Public Reaction Nuclear Power 84, hydroelectric power installations could produce more electricity than the entire present nuclear system at lower stable costs without the hazards of non-renewable sources. Second, Lester Brown, Natural History, February 82, says, quote, within the U.S., the current 71,000 megawatts of hydroelectric generating capacity could be raised dramatically if dams that do not have power generating facilities were equipped with them. Undeveloped sites could be exploited to develop some 300,000 megawatts of power. My third argument for replacing nuclear power is that conservation is capable of decreasing demand for electricity in the U.S. If all U.S. appliances were replaced by the most efficient modules currently available, summer peak electricity demand would fall by about 75,000 megawatts, more than the current nuclear capacity. Christopher Flavin, The Futurist, April 85. Now that I've shown that it is feasible to replace nuclear power with renewable energy, my partner will further prove the feasibility of our plan.
My colleague has demonstrated that our plan is a feasible one because first, nuclear power does not produce a very large portion of our energy, and second, because renewable energy sources show every indication of becoming technically, commercially, and financially viable, thereby replacing nuclear power. I will further show the feasibility of our plan. I have 3 arguments. First, clean coal technology is cheap, long-lasting, and safer than the nuclear alternative. Second, the transition away from nuclear power will not present any major problems. And third, nuclear power is losing its popularity. My first argument is that clean coal technology is cheap, long-lasting, and safer than the nuclear alternative. Clean coal is economically feasible. According to Charles Kamenoff, head of a prestigious energy consulting firm, quote, a coal-fired plant can be built around today with state-of-the-art pollution control for around $1,200 per installed kilowatt. A nuclear plant costs $3,000 per kilowatt. Peter Stoller, Time, 13th February 1984. Nuclear costs have increased from this already high figure and are today at around $3,800 per kilowatt. In fact, Clinton nuclear power costs $4,300 per kilowatt. Clean coal can be implemented and is safer than the nuclear alternative. I have 2 supports. First, Richard Munson states in his 1987 book, The Energy Switch, that, quote, a major advantage of new coal technologies is that they can be economically built in small units to meet uncertain demand for electricity. Some can be retrofitted to aging power stations, offering dramatic environmental improvements. The U.S. government is supporting these developments with a $400 million allocation. Second, projections for plants to be completed in 1988 indicate that their emissions will be 91% below those in 1971. Very common Republic reactions to nuclear power in 1984. I've thus shown that clean coal technology is cheap, long-lasting, and safer than the nuclear alternative. My second argument is that the transition away from nuclear power will present no major problems. This rests on two facts. Electricity demand is not increasing drastically, and utilities have excess reserve margins that are more than adequate. Electricity demand is not increasing drastically. As John Hanrahan states in his April 21, 1987 St. Louis Post-Dispatch article, electricity demand will grow by no more than 2% per year, and likely even less. Utility reserve margins, excess generating capacities present in case of an emergency, according to Peter Stoller, are at 30%. This is more than adequate. Quote, U.S. utilities possess a large number of excess power plants. Even if utilities were to immediately shut down all nuclear plants, only New England would be unable to reliably supply electric power to its customers with its own plants. Richard Munson, 1987. It is therefore obvious that the transition away from nuclear power will present no major problems. My third argument is that nuclear power is losing its popularity universally among the American public, foreign nations, and even the utilities themselves. Utilities are realizing that nuclear power is an inviable option. Robert Sherrod, chairman of Georgia Power and head of a U.S. Committee for Energy Awareness, a pro-nuclear group, states that, quote, no utility executive in the country will consider ordering one today unless he wanted to be certified or committed. Peter Stoller, 1984. Mr. Sherrod certainly knows what he's talking about. As of July 1st, 1987, there are 116 canceled plants and 14 plants that are permanently shut down. Furthermore, all plants ordered since 1974 have been canceled, and no new orders have been placed for the past 10 years. Union of Concerned Scientists, Nuclear Power Economics, July 1987. There's increasing resistance to nuclear power among the American public. The July 1987 issue of Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist shows the facts. In 1985, 65% of the U.S. public was against nuclear power. This figure increased since. A recent public opinion survey just last year has shown that 75% were hostile to the idea of fission-based power. Many foreign nations are now taking anti-nuclear positions, showing that national anti-nuclear measures are feasible. Although it now depends on nuclear power for over half of its electricity, Sweden has promised to eliminate its 12 nuclear plants by the year 2010. San Francisco Examiner, 1st of December, 1987. Thus, I have shown that nuclear power has lost its popularity universally. In conclusion, the affirmative proposes to push nuclear power aside because it has not been able to demonstrate that it is an economical form of energy, evidenced by increasing construction times as well as gross cost overruns which affect the public through rate hikes. It is also evident that nuclear power is a serious danger to the environment and public safety. We resolve that nuclear power be replaced with budding renewable energy sources. Furthermore, these renewable sources will eventually take up the task of energy production for the entire United States. Renewable sources have proven themselves to be safe, reliable, and cost-effective, and therefore constitute the ideal energy source for America to depend upon. For these reasons, we, the affirmative, believe that the construction of new nuclear plants should be terminated now before it is too late.
My name is Mark Paci, and I represent the negative. My colleague has demonstrated that there is no need to abandon nuclear power with the following four arguments. First, nuclear power is a safe way of producing electricity. Second, nuclear waste is not a problem, and it is safely taken care of by the nuclear industry. Third, nuclear power is economically feasible. And fourth, nuclear energy has been successful, practical, and a reliable method of producing energy in the United States. I will now show that the affirmative plan is not feasible. I have two arguments which demonstrate this. First, nuclear energy is needed to satisfy the increasing demand for electricity in the United States. And second, without nuclear power, the U.S. will be forced to depend on dangerous, economically unstable, and depleting energy sources. My first argument is that nuclear power is needed to satisfy the increasing demand for electricity in the U.S. I have 6 supports. First, quote, according to the North American Electric Reliability Council, the next 10 years should see a demand for electric energy growing at a rate of 2.3% a year. That's probably as good a projection as any. And if 2.3% doesn't sound spectacular, well, it isn't exactly negligible either. A.W. Dahlberg, Vital Speeches, July 1st, 1987. Second, quote, many of these nuclear power problems have been exacerbated and exploited by critics for using the accident at Chernobyl, which even Soviets acknowledge is irrelevant to U.S. nuclear power plants, as an excuse to call for a shutdown of our second largest source of electricity. They fail to acknowledge that over the long term, the United States, like every other industrialized nation, will need a growing supply of electric power to fuel its economy. That additional electric power must come mainly from coal and nuclear power. Harold Finger, Omni Magazine, December 1986. My third piece of evidence, quote, many U.S. energy experts are calling for an aggressive commercial nuclear energy program over the next several decades in order to ensure an adequate supply of electricity in the future. John Harahan, St. Louis Post, April 24th, 1987. And fourth, quote, moreover, although a variety of alternative sources of energy are available to utilities and several promising new non-nuclear technologies are under development, abandoning nuclear power might well render the nation's electricity supply substantially less efficient and less environmentally benign. Richard Lester, Scientific American, March 1986. Fifth, quote, Energy Secretary Peter Walker of the United Kingdom said, if we care about the standard of living of generations yet to come, we must meet the challenge of nuclear age and not retreat into the irresponsible course of leaving our children and grandchildren a world in deep and probably irreversible decline. Christopher Flavin, Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, July-August 1987. And finally, my sixth piece of evidence, quote, nuclear power provides about 16% of our energy today. Projections show nuclear providing 20% by the year 1990. Electricity, 1987. I have clearly shown that because of the increasing demand for electricity in the United States, nuclear power cannot be abandoned. My second argument is that without nuclear power, the U.S. will be forced to depend on dangerous, economically unstable, and rapidly depleting energy sources. Coal, hydroelectric, and solar power plants all have serious faults, thereby making nuclear power essential to our energy mix. I will explain the problems with each of these alternative energy sources. I will first talk about coal. The coal industry is harmful to the environment and unsafe for workers. Also, it will be very expensive to solve these environmental problems. I have 4 supports showing this. My first support, quote, coal is difficult to burn cleanly. Acid rain and other byproducts of coal combustion are causing serious damage to the environment and will be expensive to control. And in the future, carbon dioxide released by the combustion of fossil fuels may have a severe effect on the global climate. Richard Lester, Scientific American, March 1986. Second, quote, in 1985, the U.S. utilities used about 255 million tons of high sulfur coal. Some 45 to 54 million tons of high sulfur coal is being used in plants equipped with flue gas desulfurization treatment, and most of this use is in eastern states. This leaves 200 to 209 million tons of high sulfur coal being used without FGD treatment. These plants are at risk if acid rain legislation is passed. Estimates range from $20 to $30 billion capital investment and $5 to $9 billion per year operating costs to reduce sulfur dioxide emission from these old medium to high sulfur coal burning plants. Earl Rowe, Mining Engineering, January 1987. Third, quote, according to statistics, there have been 942 mine deaths since the year 1970. Douglas Purdue, Richmond Times, June 18, 1987. And finally, quote, to summarize, coal can by no means be called an ideal source of energy. It is dangerous to mine, bulky, and costly to transport, handle, and to store. It is dirty and is the cause of major environmental problems from the mine to the smokestack. Hans Landsberg, Environment, July-August 1987. These reports clearly show that coal does have major problems. I would now like to talk about hydroelectric power. Hydroelectric power is dangerous and does not have the potential to be relied on as a major energy source. I have 3 supports showing this. First, quote, conversationalists have fought long battles with planners over rights of way for reindeer, routes for salmon to reach their spawning grounds, and restoration of rocky landscapes. There has also been a debate about warm water from hydroelectric power stations creating banks of mist. The water droplets, claims a government meteorologist, cling to vegetation, form ice on buds, and kill trees. Brown and Jones, New Scientist, October 16, 1986. Second, quote, the generation method is clean and in some cases relatively inexpensive, but its use is expected to grow only modestly in the years ahead. Most sites suitable for large-scale hydroelectric plants have already been developed. Electric energy sources, 1987. And finally, my last piece of evidence, quote, the consequences of dam failure could be even larger. Thousands or tens of thousands of deaths, and these have a higher probability than large reactor accidents. Michio Kaku and Jennifer Trainor, Nuclear Power, Both Sides, 1982. This evidence clearly shows the problems with hydroelectric power. Finally, I would like to talk about solar energy. Solar energy is far too expensive and unreliable to be depended upon as an important energy source. I have 4 supports. First, quote, in all cases, the expense of solar power plants, coupled with their inherently low reliability, will present a significant obstacle to the widespread market penetration. Electric energy sources, 1987. Second, quote, the solar electricity produces costs of $9 per watt, about twice as much as the cost of energy produced from coal or nuclear power plants. New York Times, February 11th, 1987. Third, quote, the goal of the now defunct Synthetic Fuels Corporation to produce 2 million barrels a day of alternative fuels by 1990 is only a memory. The solar industry is reeling. Charles Ebinger, New York Times, January 9th, 1987. And fourth, quote, as for solar-produced electricity, because of the relatively high cost of electricity produced from the photovoltaic systems manufactured today, current use in Maine and nationally as well is generally limited to remote applications which do not have access to utility systems. Pat Nyhan, Maine Times, October 2nd, 1987. These reports clearly show the problems with nuclear power. I have demonstrated that because of the problems with the coal industry, hydroelectric, and solar power, we cannot afford to follow the affirmative plan to eliminate nuclear power. There is a strong need to develop the nuclear industry, not to abandon it. The proposed plan of action is in no way feasible. Nuclear power is one of our most promising solutions to solving the country's growing energy needs. Without nuclear power, we will be forced to depend on rapidly depleting energy sources that are not as safe, cheap, or reliable as nuclear power. In conclusion, my colleague and I have clearly demonstrated that the affirmative plan is unnecessary and infeasible. We have done so with the following arguments. 1. Nuclear power is a safe way of producing electricity. 2. Nuclear waste is not a problem, and it is safely taken care of by the nuclear industry. 3. Nuclear power is economically feasible. 4. Nuclear power has been a successful, practical, and reliable method of energy production in the U.S. 5. Nuclear energy is needed to satisfy the increasing demand for electricity in the United States. And 6. Without nuclear power, the U.S. will be forced to depend on dangerous, economically unstable, and rapidly depleting energy sources. As Harrison Brown stated in the 1986 October edition of Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, quote, it would be foolish for a major nation such as the United States to abandon nuclear power, since it will be badly needed in the future. Instead, we should learn how to use it safely in all of its aspects, ranging from reactor safety to waste handling and disposal, and in the process build up technological capabilities as well as public confidence.
My opponent has stated that for a number of reasons that there is a need to stop nuclear power. First, nuclear power is not safe, and second, it is uneconomical. I would like to refute both of these arguments. First, my opponent stated that nuclear power is not safe because there are nuclear accidents such as the one at Chernobyl. This argument is not relevant to the discussion of licensing nuclear power plants in the United States because U.S. plants are not like Chernobyl. Quote, but Chernobyl is proof that it can happen, not here, but there. This should be no surprise. Anyone with any understanding of quality control and a command economy must be uneasy about the ambitious Soviet nuclear power program. This goes double for anyone who knows that many Soviet reactors are built without containments, the reinforced concrete structures that prevented the release of any but trivial radiation at 3 Mile Island. Second, my opponent stated that nuclear power is not safe because there is human error on the job. There are now many new jobs of training people to make sure that people who are on the job will be careful. Quote, training for mechanical maintenance, electrical maintenance, and I&C personnel is provided under a formal certification program for each discipline. There are also certification programs for other positions such as licensed operators, non-licensed operators, health physics technicians, chemistry technicians, and upper plant management. Third, my opponent stated that the operating history of nuclear power plants is bad and that the NRC has cited numerous accidents. But the reason for this is that the reason that NRC has cited so many accidents is that they are so careful in monitoring nuclear power. Quote, Scott Peters, a spokesman for the Atomic Industrial Forum, said, employees at nuclear plants are committed to write down everything that goes out of whack. A light bulb out on a panel, a supervisor signing in late, all the way up to a major accident. There were only 41 occurrences which the NRC determined as significant from the standpoint of public safety from 1981 to 1986. Fourth, my opponent stated that in the normal operating state, a nuclear power is bad because of radiation released from plants. Yet, quote, the average resident of the United States is exposed to about 140 to 150 millirems of radiation a year. The usual annual exposure to the nearest neighbor of a nuclear power plant is just about 1 millirem more per year. To people living farther away, it is lower still. Fifth, my opponent stated that nuclear waste is dangerous, therefore nuclear power is not safe because it is dangerous when it is stored and it is dangerous in transport. I will refute both of these. First, quote, high-level radioactive waste is put in an inert form, then put in a container, which by law must be good for 300 to 1,000 years before it will even breach. These containers have been dropped 2,000 feet from planes onto concrete surfaces, and they do not break or leak. They will never approach that degree of severity while in the ground. John Mann, personal interview, 1988. Second, nuclear waste is my opponent said that it is not safely transported, but it is. Quote, we have never had a death from the transport of radioactive waste or nuclear reactors in the United States. John Mann, personal interview, March 1988. Thereby I have proven that nuclear power is safe. I will now refute the argument of my opponents that nuclear power is uneconomical. First, they said that it is uneconomical because construction prices are so high, and they seem to be saying that it will continue to be this way. But there is a reason that in the past construction has been so high priced. Quote, after TMI, regulation became so much more stiff and complex that nuclear utilities were forced to totally overhaul the structure of the people, design, and inspections. This drastically raised costs. John Patton, personal interview, March 1988. They also said that that it is uneconomical because decommissioning costs are so high. But stopping licensing of nuclear power plants now will not solve that problem because we'll still have to decommission all the plants that are coming out that are finishing their life. Quote, even if reactor ordering ground to a halt tomorrow, more than 500 reactors, including those currently under construction, will have to be decommissioned. Safely retiring those plants will require new technologies and a plan for disposing of the mountains of radioactive waste that are being created. Aggressive, well-funded research and development programs could pave the way. My opponent also stated that nuclear power is much less reliable than coal, and seemed to be saying that because it is unreliable, it costs more once it is online. But, quote, once a nuclear plant actually goes online, the power generated from it is relatively insensitive to inflation because fuel represents such a small portion of the final cost of nuclear produced electricity. Lastly, they said that we'll be hurt by rate hikes. We'll be hurt by rate hikes because of nuclear power. But, quote, consumers could save millions of dollars as a result of an Illinois Commerce Commission vote requiring Illinois Power to pay all operating and maintenance costs for the Clinton nuclear power plant. Nuclear power, in the case where nuclear power makes rate hikes, it will not be passed on to the consumer. In conclusion, I have refuted the argument stated by the affirmative that nuclear power is not safe and uneconomical.
My opponents have brought up the claim that Chernobyl cannot happen here in the United States and that United States plants are safe. This is weak because it is simply not supported by the scientific evidence. Although there are only 2 graphite reactors like Chernobyl in the United States, this is not relevant. The accident which occurred was entirely unrelated to this fact. Quote, most experts, including Harold R. Denton, nuclear director of regulation for the NRC, believe the difficulties at Chernobyl began when cooling water stopped flowing to the reactor core, perhaps because of a leak in the cooling system or turbine failure. This means that it was simply a loss of coolant accident, completely unrelated to the fact that it was a graphite reactor. My second support is that, quote, the threat to Americans from nuclear power plants is very real. For example, there are 39 reactors in the United States that have a containment system similar to that at Chernobyl. These containments could be breached by an accident more severe than they were designed to withstand. This is what happened at Chernobyl. Union of Concerned Scientists, Voter Information Packet, 1987. This shows that there is nothing inherent to American reactors which makes them immune to the problems that happened at Chernobyl. My third support is that, quote, Western experts now agree that a large structure of heavy steel and concrete did in fact enclose the Chernobyl reactor. Moreover, it appears to have been designed to withstand pressures that are comparable to those in many American reactors. This helps show that a Chernobyl-type accident could happen in the U.S. since its containment facility was comparable to those used here. My fourth support is that, quote, on this, the first anniversary of the Chernobyl accident, it is important for U.S. citizens to recognize that a major nuclear accident of similar proportions can occur here, said Joshua Gordon, a nuclear policy analyst. The Times-Picayune, 26 April 1987. This shows, again, that Chernobyl certainly could happen here. My last support, with which I'd like to close, is that, quote, Thomas Cochrane, a senior scientist at the National Resources Defense Council and a former advisor to both the NRC and the Department of Energy, testified that, quote, the most important lesson to be learned from Chernobyl is that a core melt can happen. It can happen anywhere, anytime, in any large operating reactor in the U.S. or abroad. Hence, I have shown that Chernobyl certainly could happen here, and even if it didn't happen in the same way, the effects could be the same. Thank you very much.
My opponents brought up three arguments I would like to refute. The first argument is that solar plant costs $9 per watt. This is fallacious. According to Jim Schefter of Popular Science, February 85, he says, quote, Leggett engineers brought in Solar Plant 1 for about $2.80 per watt. Solar Plant 1 will produce power at 2 cents per kilowatt hour, and Solar Plant 1's production costs are less than the national average. Therefore, this shows that solar power is cheap and not as expensive as my opponents have claimed. The second argument, my opponents have only minimally addressed the issue of increasing construction costs of nuclear power plants. According to a graph picked up from the source picked up for you this week, 1987, it shows that in 1970, nuclear power plants cost $2.50 per kilowatt hour. In 1980, it cost $800 per kilowatt hour. In 85, it cost $2,250 per kilowatt hour. And then in 1987, it increased to $3,800 per kilowatt hour. Therefore, I have shown that construction costs for nuclear power plants are increasing. The third argument my opponents have raised is that operation of nuclear power does not hurt people in the surrounding communities. I have two supports showing that nuclear power does affect the people in the communities and that there are people nearby nuclear power plants to be affected. Quote, another study by the National Cancer Institute from 1969 to 71 showed that in Colorado communities downwind of Rocky Flats power plant, cancer rates were 24% higher than normal for men and 10% higher for women. The National Academy of Science Committee recently estimated that 1 person in 1,000 will develop cancer from radiation by the year 2000. National Action Research on Military Industrial Complex, Atoms for Peace, Atoms for War, May 1979. Second, it is seen that there are many people who live near plants. According to Andrea Gaber, U.S. News and World Report, 12 May 1986, quote, some 3 million people live within 10 miles of a reactor. Therefore, I have shown that many people live near reactors and that many people are hurt every year by reactors. In conclusion, my opponents brought up three arguments that were fallacious. Solar plants are cheap. Nuclear power construction costs are an issue that must be addressed, and construction costs for nuclear power are increasing.
My opponents have said the following arguments. First, that coal is safe and cheap to make so. Second, that hydropower is safe. Third, that solar power is cheap. Fourth, that U.S. containment is not good. And fifth, that the public is against nuclear power. And finally, sixth, that conservation will make a large impact on our energy needs. I'd like to refute each one of these. First, my opponent said that coal is safe and cheap to make so. In fact, coal is dangerous and will be costly to fix. First, quote, The Earth's atmosphere is being overloaded with gases that trap heat like a greenhouse, causing polar ice to melt in flood coastal areas, and bringing about shifts in weather patterns that can produce droughts in breadbaskets such as the Midwest. This shows the bad effects of coal. And also, as I have already stated, costs of $20 to $30 billion capital investment and $5 to $9 billion per year operating costs will be needed to reduce the sulfur dioxide emissions from several old coal plants. Next, my opponent said that hydropower was okay and it was safe. This is not true. First, quote, lake taps for hydroelectric power cause difficulties above ground as well as below. A rapid fall in the water level of a lake can cause pressure changes in the banks and set off landslides. Brown and Jones, New Scientist, 16th of October, 1986. And as I already stated, consequences of dam failures could be thousands or tens of thousands of deaths, and these have a higher probability than large reactor accidents. Michio Kaku, Jennifer Trainor, Nuclear Power, both sides, 1982. My opponents have also said that solar power is cheap and has no problems. This is not so. My first quote, solar power may require large land areas, one of the problematic environmental impacts of solar energy. To supply the electric power needs for a city the size of Pittsburgh, for example, would require a collection area of about 30 square miles. Electric Energy Sources, 1987. This shows that solar plants will take up too much space. And second quote, it will take a technological breakthrough before cheap, efficient photovoltaic devices are perfected. As in all the emerging technologies, the problem with storage must also be developed, or the system will need a backup to provide power when the sun is not shining. Electric Energy Sources, 1987. This shows that solar power is not ready to be used. My opponents have also brought up the point that containment is not sufficient in the U.S. I'd like to refute this. First, I have a quote. Quote, however, at all U.S. reactors of these types, the containment envelope completely surrounds the reactor, unlike the Chernobyl design, where the core lies outside the main containment. Thus, it could be said that U.S. reactors have a containment superior to that used at Chernobyl. Likewise, these reactors are not prone to the power instabilities which plague the RBMK-1000 design, which was the design at the Chernobyl reactor. This shows that the containment is sufficient to solve a problem in the U.S., and accident similar to Chernobyl could not happen. My opponents also stated that the public opinion is against nuclear power. This is irrelevant, since most of the public is not educated enough to have a valid opinion on the subject, and their opinions have been made without scientific proof. Quote, the usual local reaction to a proposal to site a nuclear plant or a repository for radioactive waste in the vicinity suggests that it is the public's perception of nuclear risk, rather than any scientific estimate of it, which determines their attitude. This, no author, Nuclear Engineering International, September 1987. This shows that the public opinion is not based on any facts. Finally, my opponents have said that conservation will make a difference in our energy needs. However, this is not so. Conservation will not make that big of an impact. Quote, despite conservation efforts, however, new power plants still must be built to meet future increases in electricity demand. Electric Energy Sources, 1987. This shows that conservation will not make a large enough impact to call for the abandoning of nuclear power. In conclusion, my colleague and I have both clearly shown that the affirmative plan is unnecessary and infeasible. The following arguments show this. First, that nuclear power is a safe way of producing electricity. Second, that nuclear waste is not a problem, and it is safely taken care of by the nuclear industry. Third, that nuclear power is economically feasible. Fourth, that nuclear power has been a successful, practical, and reliable method of energy production in the United States. Fifth, that nuclear energy is needed to satisfy the increasing demand for electricity in the United States. And sixth, without nuclear power, the U.S. will be forced to depend on dangerous, economically unstable, and depleting energy sources. As William Lee said in a quote from Vital Speeches on October 15, 1986, quote, I firmly believe our nation needs the nuclear option for future baseload capacity. It is clean, it is safe, and it uses a secure fuel source.
My opponents have presented two vacuous arguments that I will now refute. First, my opponents claim that nuclear power is necessary since coal produces too much carbon dioxide, resulting in the heating of the earth through the greenhouse effect. In fact, this is not true. I have two supports. First, acid rain and the greenhouse effect are serious environmental problems that require action now, entirely independent of whether another nuclear plant is ever built. Nuclear power plants produce one of the most dangerous pollutants of all, long-lasting, highly radioactive nuclear waste. U.S. power plants and the Department of Energy facilities currently produce over 12,000 tons of highly radioactive waste per year. It makes no sense to argue that the solution to one environmental problem is the introduction of another environmental nightmare. Union of Concerned Scientists, Voter Packet Information, 1987. Second, quote, whether or not nuclear power is used will have only a modest effect on the rate of increase which the world approaches its possible rendezvous with climatic disaster. The 500 large nuclear power plants that would be in operation in the world optimistically by the year 2000 would reduce the annual carbon dioxide increase by less than 10%. Carbon dioxide would continue to rise almost as fast as in the absence of nuclear power. Michio Kaku, Nuclear Power, Both Sides, 1982. Thus, carbon dioxide production does not imply a need for nuclear power. My opponents have also expressed their concern for future generations. If they are genuinely concerned, they will realize that nuclear power does hurt future generations. It hurts our children, our grandchildren, and many generations thereafter. I have two supports. First, Ken Weaver states in his 1979 National Geographic article, quote, in 1969, barrels of dangerous waste were dumped in the ocean. In 1979, a manned submersible discovered the crushed and leaking containers of nuclear garbage, dumped off the coasts of Delaware and California a decade before. Second, Michio Kaku in his 1982 book, Nuclear Power, Both Sides, states, quote, let us consider a few consequences of a temperature rise at a waste dump. The heated rock will expand. This will lift the rock above the waste and cause the rock to fracture. If water penetrates through the cracks in the fractured rock, it can dissolve the waste and carry it back to the biosphere. Thus, a truly concerned member of society would realize that nuclear power will harm future generations. Furthermore, our plan calls for the eventual elimination of coal. I'd like to take this time to restate our arguments. There is a need to abolish nuclear power since it is not safe and uneconomical. Nuclear power is not safe. We have presented 5 reasons for this. First, a nuclear accident will do colossal damage to the public and the environment. Second, the presence of human error makes a disastrous accident probable. Third, nuclear plants have a dangerous operating history. Fourth, normally operating plants release dangerous amounts of radiation. And fifth, nuclear waste is unsafe. We also have given 5 reasons showing that nuclear plants are grossly uneconomical. First, construction costs are excessive and rising. Second, decommissioning will carry tremendous costs. Third, nuclear power plants are unreliable producers of electricity. Fourth, nuclear plants increase electric rates. And finally, fifth, nuclear power financially endangers utilities. We have further presented a fully feasible plan which will phase out nuclear-based power and eventually be completely dependent upon renewable sources. This plan is feasible. My colleagues and I have provided 6 supports for this. First, nuclear power does not produce a very large percentage of our electricity. Second, renewable energy sources show every indication of becoming commercially, technically, and financially viable, thereby replacing nuclear power. Third, clean coal technology is cheap, long-lasting, and safer than the nuclear alternative. Fourth, conservation will decrease the energy demand in the United States. And fifth, and finally sixth, nuclear power is losing its popularity among the American public, foreign nations, and even utilities themselves. Nuclear power has been and always will be a menace to the environment, human health, and the economy. We must stop building new nuclear plants immediately and begin the phasing out of existing ones before it is too late and irreparable damage is done. Nuclear plants are neither safe nor economical. Furthermore, the majority of the American public opposes nuclear power and its implications. We have the technology to replace nuclear electricity with cleaner, renewable sources such as photovoltaic, hydroelectric, geothermal, and clean coal. This is a viable solution to long-term energy demands and will benefit all of mankind, making this world a safer place to live in.